Alright, so I've been wanting to bring another video to you guys on growing plants to their genetic potential. The last video I definitely hit on the key things that you need as far as the organic ingredients, the compost, the worm castings, but more importantly, or just as important as that, would be keeping the microbes, the rhizobacteria, keeping it alive and creating an environment that will promote the best growth of those bacteria so that they can really just promenade and continue to grow and thrive. Because the more the rhizobacteria and the other microbes in the soil thrive, the better your plants are going to do. Now, I constantly get asked this question, and that is, what sort of schedule should I water this plant or that plant? And I do answer, the question when people ask this, but I wanted to bring it to you in this video because it really does have a lot to do with growing a plant to its potential, because depending on how you water really does greatly affect that. So especially if you're growing in containers, you have to be really careful to make sure that you're watering them properly. And certain plants like citrus trees and stuff are more sensitive to it, but certainly the best that you can water your plants, then the best growth you're going to see out of them. So it is a very important question, and many things in our lives do have a schedule, and I think this is where people get the idea that you should water on a schedule. People do set timers for watering their lawns and things like that, and that may work for a lawn, especially if you want to water it in the morning before the sun comes up, or in the evening or something like that. But gardening, and especially watering things in containers, is not like that. I know some drip irrigation systems, gardeners will set them on a timer to make sure their plants get enough water. They can go on vacation, etc., not have to worry about it. But really, for the most part, you are not watering on a schedule, especially when it comes to watering things in containers. So I learned a lot of this through experience, and I was doing some of these things without realizing it, and I'm going to let you guys know really, in my opinion, the best way to be watering your plants. And this was confirmed by watching other experienced gardeners' channels, like Ray from Praxis 55712 had an excellent episode on the way that he waters, and I realized I was doing a lot of the things the way he was doing when it came to watering, but I did learn some things from the video that he put out. I can't recall what the episode was called. Oftentimes he doesn't really title his videos necessarily what the episode is about, but essentially what you want to do when you're watering is, number one, don't water on a schedule, especially in pots, because depending on the size of the pot is really going to depend upon how quickly that pot dries out. A small pot, obviously you're going to need to water more often because it's small. And I suppose somebody could get really scientific with it, and depending on where you lived and how hot it gets and how dry or humid it is, or depending on the volume of the pot, it's going to dry out this fast, and that's just too much. There's a simpler way to do it, and that is to just check and keep an eye on your pot to see when it is drying out. One way you could do that is you can do the I think what people call the 2-knuckle rule, where you stick your finger in the soil down to the second knuckle. If it's dry, it's time to water. Now, that is not foolproof. I also like to feel the weight of the pot. you should know what the pot feels like when you first plant that plant or that tree, and you water it through very thoroughly the first time. You want to make sure you water it so that the growing medium really soaks in the water to the point to where it starts draining out the bottom. And then you're going to feel that pot, and it's going to feel quite heavy, and it'll feel much different when it begins to dry out. So if the top of your soil starts to get dry and the weight of the pot is drastically less, then that's probably a good time to water. Now, it doesn't really matter what method you use or how you do it. You're not always going to water at the most effective time. Nobody's perfect. There's just no way to be perfect about it. You can get pretty close through experience and using these different methods, but yeah, just especially when it comes to containers, one other thing that I like to do is mulch. And this goes back to growing your plants to their genetic potential, because the mulch is going to do several things. First of all, when the mulch breaks down, it helps to feed the soil, which feeds the plant. The mulch also helps provide a protective covering so that the soil does not completely dry out. If your soil completely dries out, the bacteria are dying off by the millions. So the mulch is key to that. So, and this kind of goes along with the what some people call the back to Eden garden method, is the covering that Paul talks about throughout that video. The covering is essential to his gardening method, and he knows that he's not the first one to come up with this, and he didn't call it the back to Eden garden method. The makers of the documentary called it that. And certainly people have been mulching for thousands of years because they understand the benefits of mulching. But the Back to Eden video definitely sort of reaffirms that and has gotten a lot of people thinking about that. But there's other things that you have to do to be successful. And a lot of these things I did talk about in the previous video of growing your plants to their genetic potential. And keeping those bacteria and the microbes alive is going to be key, because you certainly don't want to just, put a layer of worm castings over the top of your soil, and then the sun comes along and it bakes it and it kills all the beneficial bacteria. Well, then essentially all you have is a 1-1-1 fertilizer you've put on there with now no living organisms in it. So the mulch is key to keeping the moisture and keeping the protective layer on there, especially for when these pots and plants get moved outside and they're exposed to the sun. The mulch will protect those living organisms in the soil to be sure, and give them a nice home. And as it breaks down, it will also feed the soil, which feeds the plant. And you can use wood chips, you can use leaves, you can use bark, you can use whatever you want to use. Of course, bark is going to break down slower, but bark does have its benefits, and that is that you don't really have to be concerned with whether or not it's aged, like wood chips. Because if you go throwing wood chips in your soil, or you accidentally get some of those wood chips mixed in when you're digging around, if those wood chips aren't properly aged, then they are going to take nutrients, they're going to take nitrogen and so forth away from the soil, away from the plants, because they'll soak it up to start breaking it down, and then they'll release that nitrogen back to the soil, but it can be harmful. Bark has little nutrients in it, a little bit of nitrogen and other nutrients, and so it typically isn't a problem. In fact, some people will grow in bark. I've seen people grow in soil mixtures that were 50% bark, um, and it does very well. So if you want to use bark to mulch and you're concerned about nitrogen, or like myself, when I go digging around in my soil, I have a tendency to sometimes not get the mulch far enough out of the way, and some of it gets mixed into the soil when, say, I'm harvesting potatoes or something like that. So bark is nice for that. So some other things you need to know about growing in containers, like I have with these citrus trees, is the citrus trees need very well drainage. And on some of these pots, I may have gone a little overboard with the drainage holes, but regardless, you've got to be careful that the bottoms don't get too dry. And I've actually had instances where I had pots that were too much of air-putting pot, too much air was getting in there, and the soil medium was drying up too quickly, and it actually killed back the roots of the citrus tree. And that's what actually happened to this kumquat tree right here. And I've used different containers since that experience. But the other thing that I discovered is how beneficial it is to actually get a tub of water, and I put a little bit of nutrients in there, some fish fertilizer, some worm castings, and stir it up really well, and then soak these pots, let them soak up the water, because I've noticed, especially when your soil mediums contain things like peat moss or coco coir, when these things dry out, they don't rehydrate so easily. So it is very helpful, and your plants will thank you for it if you make sure and you make sure that the medium gets hydrated. And the way that I did that is by taking all of these plants a couple weeks ago and setting them in a tub of water for about 10 minutes each so they could soak it up, and then setting them someplace where they could drain. So another tub with maybe a raised area. What I did is I turned a pot upside down. I set the container on top of the upside down pot, and it drained. You want to give them, 10 to 15 minutes to drain. And then once that was done, I put them back out here, put them on their little protective trays here, and they did very well. As you can see, I have lemons and grapefruit growing. I have new growth, new branches everywhere. So making sure that soil medium gets hydrated is key, because if you're just top watering, what I found is when that water hits dry patches of soil, it will just flow right around it or right through it, and it won't hydrate it. So this is going to be key to growing your plants to their genetic potential. Anyway, I hope this video has helped you out in some way. Hopefully it helps you with your container growing, and when you're growing outside. This stuff applies outside as well, because and obviously things are going to be a little bit different from climate to climate where you live, but mulch is key. So keep that in mind. Hopefully this helps you out. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.